Coming up this month as part of our special effects issue of BRM, Phil Parker shares his tips for choosing paint when completing your models, I respray a Helgen Class 60 and give some pointers on the techniques used, and Michael Russell explains his wet-in-wet painting technique of equal use on back scenes as it is on your rolling stock. And don't miss the extras menu of this disc where David Palmer will give a guided tour of the new releases from his Train Tech range. But first, let's get straight to our layout of the month from this issue of the magazine, Boardsy.
I bought the layout primarily because I liked it. I've always had an interest in the Great Eastern British Railways era, particularly fostered by Ian Rice and his earlier writings. I'd seen the layout at an exhibition and was captivated by it, how well it operated. The operation was such that I knew buying it from the builder, Chris Matthewman, or from his estate rather, because sadly he's passed away, that I'd be getting a layout that was well built, reliable, and looked really good, which was important to me. The buildings on the layout are scratch built, super quick papers. The edges on them are really well defined, almost that you could shave yourself with them. All the mortar lines line up, they're subtly weathered. It's really an example of how to use brick papers. It is that sort of classic example. The layout came as per Chris operated it, which was late 1930s LNER, and it was all in grouping era, had LNER signage, horses and carts across it, lots of people. So the thing to change it into the Great Eastern 1950s era, the big thing was the signage, which is what I've changed, and you can see that reflected with the blue BR signage on it. A lot of the rest of it was pretty much left as is, apart from removing horse and carts and people in 1930s era clothing. The war years there was very little development, so the line and the branch infrastructure etc. pretty much would have stayed as per the 1930s right the way into the 1950s. Before then we started to get beaching and the effects of that, branch line closures etc. The changes I've made to the layout have been minimal. Partly because of that era, very little change. I didn't want to change anything of Chris's work to any great degree because it is such fine work. Maintenance, of course, with a layout like this is sometimes challenging. I've got one point motor that is causing me a bit of a problem, and because it's an old point motor I can't replace it with something conventional off the shelf. I have to repair either the original or find something and adapt it to make it work as the original does. I'm quite fortunate that with the skill set that I've got I can do some of that work, and I also know other people a little bit older than myself who are also familiar with the era and the style in which this layout was built. This was built late 1980s, but arguably with techniques from 1960s or so. Someone modelling well in the 1960s would recognise the control systems within this layout and how it functions. So some of it has been a bit of a learning curve, but again Chris's build quality is such that it's been exceptionally reliable. I've only had to have one point motor failure repaired. The operation of this, it's EM gauge, so any of the proprietary items have been re-gauged, particularly with replacement wheel sets, either Exacta Scale or Alan Gibson. Very little else has been done apart from detailing them. In terms of what operates on the layout, I've kept it very much as per Great Eastern British Railways era branch line equipment. So the DMUs are of the era, they're of the region as well, which is particular for me in helping set where the layout is. So you see a class 24 or a class 15, you know it's likely to be Eastern region 1950s. The 04, the black 04 shunter, again with the skirts on, classic Wisbeach and Upwell East Anglian branch line engine. So again that helps set the scene of where the layout's located and the era. Nominally I've named the layout Boardsy. There was a radar station there from the Second World War where radar was developed. So the idea is that within Boardsy, the Boardsy Manor was a bit bigger than the actual small village that it is, and it actually deserved a railway line which came off the main line to Ipswich. and this represents the terminus of that branch in my imagination. I'd be very reticent about even buying a layout like this without seeing it work. Have a look at it, see that it works. Is there anything unusual about it? Is it, for example, this is a, if you like, a traditional historic type of wiring underneath. It's not DCC, it's DC. If I wanted to convert it to DCC, I imagine that could be an interesting challenge, not something that I'd be interested in. Again, the quality of the build of the layout, does it all fit together? This does, it goes together like a jigsaw, it almost falls together. So easy to put together, far easier, for example, than my own layout in Yard. The engineering quality of this is really, really superb. Longevity, again, the maintenance issues, is it contemporary stuff? If something goes wrong with it, do you have the skill set to fix it? Those are the sort of key issues in buying a layout. And I guess, is it safe? You know, you look underneath it, are there wires hanging off it? If it has a control system, you know, what sort of condition is that in? Common sense stuff. You wouldn't buy a car with wires hanging out of it, or just have a look. And again, if you haven't got the expertise, see if you can find someone else who can run an eye over it and give you that perhaps valuable second opinion. I was pretty certain I knew what I was buying, so I went and saw it by myself. But if you're not sure of that, then do try and find someone who can give you that second opinion.
Let's talk about paint. Pretty much everything we do as modelers gets covered in paint at some point. And if I'm honest, let's be honest, we pretty much know how to apply paint. We take it out of the pot with a brush and we slap it around all over the model. But this isn't the be all and end all of it. So what I'm actually going to talk about today is the preparation and the stuff we do before we start painting. First thing we need to do is we need to think about what we're painting. Here's a handy Airfix hut, and I have very quickly glued this together, which means it's covered in grease from my fingers. Now I don't have particularly greasy hands, but I've still got grease on here. There can also be mold release, lots of chemicals floating around that can just sit on the surface of the plastic. You don't really notice them, but they just stop the paint from adhering properly. Quick wash under a tap. Give it a little scrub with some washing up liquid. I know people get very excited about this and start shouting about something called lanolin, which is the chemical that makes your hands soft when you're doing the washing up. It's not actually as big a problem as modelers like to make out. The key is give it a bit of a scrub to get any grease and everything off, then loads and loads of rinsing, and then dry gently with a paper towel. It's a job you only need to do just before you paint, and then try not to handle it too much, because otherwise you transfer all the grease back from your fingers back onto the model. The other thing to think about is just dusting. Now, a fairly cheap brush, just go over the whole model again to get dust and stray cat hairs and anything else that's floating around out of the way. A nice clean surface. You've got a nice clean surface, your model is always going to look better when you start painting it. You also need to think about what the model is made of. This is a plastic hut. You can paint straight onto plastic with both acrylic and enamel paint. If you're going to use anything a bit more exotic, then I would do a test on an unseen bit. But the sort of modelling paints we use, acrylics and enamels, they will paint perfectly well onto this. You don't need to prime, they'll stick perfectly happily to the surface. This is a resin hut. It's actually 3mm to the foot. This is why it's a bit smaller than that one there, so it's a smaller scale. This is a resin hut, and polyester resin is quite a common material we find in modelling. There's quite a lot of buildings and rolling stock made from it, and it is a lovely material to work with. You can very often get away with painting straight on top of here, but you will very often find that for more complicated things there is something called mold release, which is a chemical that stops the resin from sticking to the mold. That does need scrubbing off. It is really important when using resin models to give them a scrub before you start trying to paint them. And I would usually recommend that you use a primer on there. Now this is a can of primer from Halfords, which is perfectly normal car primer. This is the bog standard. It's the cheapest primer they do. Grey seems to work for most colours. You can use reds and whites, but to be honest, I find grey is a pretty good modelling colour for the sort of thing. Do give it a shake for about 5 minutes to make sure it's properly mixed, and try and spray at room temperature, ideally outside, because this stuff does smell, even though it's an acrylic primer. Give the model a light coating of primer. Don't try and cover it in it really thickly, because you will lose all the detail. But this stuff, there are plenty of other primers out there. There are specific modelling primers, but I know most people can get their paws on this, and because it's made for car stuff, it does tend to be pretty good. If you're using something very small, Humbrol #1, I believe, is a nice paintable primer, but to be honest, I prefer to spray because it just gives you that flat coat. The other thing the primer will do is it will show up any little bits of filling or sanding required on the model, because once you turn it all a nice single grey colour, your eye just seems to pick up on these things far more than it does when it's in the raw material. Okay. Now, you might also be thinking about doing stuff with metal models. This is an etch brass hut. This is actually a Langley Models little hut that I've soldered up. And one thing I can be sure of is that your paints are not going to stick to this very well. Enamel and acrylic don't bond very well with metal, so you are going to need a primer for that. Now, you can use the standard primer here, but ideally what you actually want to use is an etching primer. Now, the etching primer actually looks the same as the standard primer, but the chemical is different in that it actually bites into the metal and really grips the surface, and then provides a nice paintable surface on top. Here's a little one I did earlier with that very can. Again, it shows up any little bits of work that need doing, any holes, any bits where you've got a bit much solder on if you've soldered the kit together. But it certainly brings up the detail as well, and that will paint really nicely. I can brush paint that quite happily. The other thing I should say with metal kits is they really do need a good scrub in the sink if you've soldered them, because fluxes and other chemicals can lurk in all the corners, and they will just go green and carry on reacting with the metal. Yes, a little bit of spray of etching primer. Again, don't go too mad. This stuff's about 15 quid a can. You don't want to use gallons of it. A light spray is enough just to give the paint something to stick to. Now, all that's great, but what happens if you're using a wooden model? Now, wood, because it's a natural material and has grain, has an interesting property. The moment you start painting it, what will happen is the grain of the wood will swell slightly, and often you'll get a furry finish as well. Now, that's not going to be very appealing. This is supposed to be a narrowboat. It's supposed to be made of metal. So you need to treat this with something. And the preferred treatment for this, and I will say, you can use a primer, it will work, but you'll need to sand back. My preferred treatment for that, and it doesn't normally need to come in a can as big as this, I just do various other projects, is a product called Sanding Sealer. This is, as I say, available in much smaller bottles than this. What this is a cellulose product with a bit of talcum powder in it. This sinks into the grain of the wood, and because it dries really quickly and the talcum powder acts as a filler, it gives you, once you've sanded it, it raises the grain, you'll sand it, and then you'll get a really glass smooth finish that again will take any paint you choose. So it's worth bearing in mind just this little bit of preparation to do before you start doing anything with the model. But what about the paint? Okay, put those to one side. I tend to use enamels, it's just what I'm more familiar with, but certainly acrylic paints are much more popular nowadays because you've got the benefit that they are water-based and they don't smell and they dry very quickly. But I'm looking at some enamels here, and you can see they all come in tinlets, and there's very many different suppliers out there. You buy the tins you want. They're available frequently in proper matching railway colours. Especially somebody like Precision Paints, they do a huge range of official railway colours to match. Humbrol do a small range of railway colours as well, especially in the acrylic line, and some of those are very good matches with Hornby models if you're doing a little bit of detailing work. But they all come generally in these little tinlets. Now, carefully lever off the lid and try not to get too much around the edge because it will stop the lid from sealing again. And you're going to need to mix it up. Now it's really, really important to mix the paint thoroughly before you use it. I know I am terrible for pulling a bit of actual paint rather than the carrying fluid and putting it on the lid, but it does dry differently and you don't get a really, really nice even colour. So you're going to need some sort of paint mixing tool. Now you can use matchsticks and all sorts of things, even plastic stirrers, although they're a lot less common. I have a couple of preferred tools. My absolute favourite is this little paint stirrer, and this is from Tamiya. They never wear out, they're made of stainless steel, and I can just wipe them clean after I've used them, and if I don't do it properly I can dunk them in some thinners for cleaning afterwards. This is a nice little paint paddle, allows me to get good mixing in there, and I can just whirl it round and round and round and keep going until I'm happy that I've got the mix. Just wipe the excess off there. Very handy tool. I think they're about a £5 for two, but they'll last forever and ever, so they're quite a nifty little tool. But if I really, really want a good mix, and I certainly do when I'm airbrushing, the other option is an electric paint mixer. Now mine is looking a little old and tired because I've had it for a couple of years. These things, spinning top at the end, battery powers in the middle, dunk it in the paint, and there we are. It's mixing away quite happily. I'll be honest, I always thought these things were a bit of a gimmick. When I first saw them, I thought, well, who's going to use that when they could just stir the paint with a paddle? You know, and that's 14 quid worth of tool, and you think to yourself, well, that seems like a bit of a gimmick. Actually, I'll be honest, I was wrong. This is actually a very nice little tool, especially if you're airbrushing and you need really, really well mixed paint when you've had to thin it. It just does a very neat job very, very quickly. And talking of thinning paint, one of the important things to think about is that different paint comes in different thicknesses. I tend to find Revell is thinner than Humbrol, and Humbrol and Precision generally about the same sort of thickness. But you will find as a modeler that different paints work differently for different people. Some people prefer very thin paint, some people want a slightly thicker one, and certain jobs, if you want a really, really smooth finish, then you actually need to apply several coats of a very thin paint. If you're doing scenic work, quite frankly, if I'm doing something that's in track colour brown, I'd just like it to be a thick coat, so I just whack it on there, but I'm not too worried about it being nice and smooth. You will need to think about thinners, and different paints need different thinners. Quite simply, this has acrylic thinners, this is for acrylic paint, this one is enamel thinner, and this is obviously for enamel paint. It's also quite handy when you've got down to about 2/3 the way down the tinlet of paint and it's just starting to go off. You can often save it with a little bit of thinner added into there, mixed in properly, and you can just about save that one more job before you have to throw the tinlet away. It's also, let's be honest, manufacturing can vary on these things. Sometimes they just put far too much pigment in. A little bit of thinners, again, will sort that out. And finally, we are going to need to think about brushes. There are, again, lots and lots of different types of brush out there. Don't use something like this. This is designed for kids to do watercolour painting in, where they do it like that. That's not a modelling brush. It's very, very useful for weathering powders and, as I say, for cleaning off models. But brush packs like this are far more used. Now, let's start. Humbrol do a very nice pack of what they call stipple brushes. These are a bristle-based brush, and I find them really useful. They're stiff, but absolutely perfect for weathering powders, and you can also do a bit of dry brushing with them. They are certainly my tool of choice for weathering powders, and they go on and on forever and ever and ever. They do various versions of coloured handle brushes as well. And the only thing I'm going to say about these is that one thing completely confused me when I first started using the Humbrol range, and that is that they are actually quite stiff when you get them out of the packet. There is a little plastic tube designed to protect the point of the bristles. You get them out and it's like, hold on, what's going on there? That's really, really stiff. What's happened is they have been filled with a gum to protect them when they're in shipping. If you don't do something, the bristles are going to get bashed and the modelers aren't going to want the brushes after a while. But it is a water-soluble gum. All you do is waggle it around in some nice clean water. Do try and get some clean water. and just pull the excess off. You can just tease the end back into a point with your fingers. But now, if you look at it, you've got a nice soft brush, but it's still got a good point on it, so it'll be perfect for painting your model and be able to get into all those nooks and crannies. So there we are. Some of the basic things you need to think about before breaking out the paint or before cracking onto model. Painting is like so many of these things. You get the preparation right and you're halfway there. So, good luck. I appreciate this is going to seem like a lot of trouble and a lot of things to think about, but now you should be ready to paint, and I look forward to seeing the results. Send us some photos into the mag.
Hello, I'm Michael Russell, and today I'm going to show you a painting technique that's very good for weathering. So, in the world, a lot of problems have been solved from people from another discipline coming along and viewing a problem from another angle. And you can do that with model railways. There's not problems to solve, but you can take techniques from other areas. So this technique I'm going to show you today is actually a watercolour technique that I've adapted for model railway use. So let me show you some watercolours to show you the technique with watercolours. First of all, this picture here, you'll notice that the trees at the top have been painted with wet paint on dry paper, and you've got a nice hard edge to the trees. Now compare that with this picture here. Now this has been done with wet paint, but the paper has been wet when I've applied the paint. This means that the colours have diffused and mingled into each other, and you get this subtle effect of the colours blending in. So the starting point for this exercise is this piece of plastic card, and all I've done with this is I've sprayed it with a car primer, and then I've sprayed a layer of enamel paint on the top of that. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to add a thinner to the surface, and to avoid any problems with damaging the surface that's already there, because this is enamel on this surface, I'm now going to use acrylic for my technique. But if you've used acrylic on here, you'd probably use enamel for your next layer, and that will work just as well. So some of the things you need to use this technique: you need to get your paints ready. I'm using 3 acrylic paints, all shades of brown from the Humble range, and all I've done is I diluted those with some thinners so they're ready to go. So I'm going to take the thinners and apply it to the piece of plastic card. And we'll just make a nice wet surface. You need to experiment a bit to see how much water or thinners you need. And all we do is take the diluted acrylic and just dab it on in a random fashion. You don't have to be precise here. You don't want it to look too regular. You want, a pattern that is more abstract. Okay, so I now need to leave that to dry, and rather than do that, I'll show you what I did earlier. So if we look at the finished result here, you can see that the colours have merged together, and you've got this sort of nebulous effect where the colours have merged and blended into each other, and it's subtle, and you don't have any hard edges. So how would you use that on a model? Well, you can see on this model shark here, I've actually used it on the roof, and the colours have blurred together, merged together to give a nice subtle effect to the model. I've also used it on one of my scrapyard engines, and I've also used it on a building. So it's a very simple technique, nothing complicated about it at all. Why don't you have a go and send us your results so we can see them.
So this issue is the special effects issue of BRM, where we're trying to give you a whole load of ideas that you can throw at your layout or projects and make them look more realistic. Things like better rust, better, more weathered wood, for example. A whole load of different things that you can do with models, but in this case I'm going to tackle Helgen's Class 60. Now this is just the chassis, we've got the body shell here, but this is a model that was released by Helgen perhaps 18 months ago now, in O gauge, and they released it at the time in about 5 or 6 different liveries. Now that's all great, but what if you want something that's different, a livery that they didn't produce, and a livery that's quite faded and that needs some of those special effects? Well, good news is I want one of those liveries, and I'm going to demonstrate here for you today how it's all done. So first things first, we've got everything laid out, we're outside, and why are we outside? It's because we're spraying. It's not something that I'd recommend you do indoors, especially not with our video team that are in our studio. We're going to be using some nasty solvents and they don't want to be breathing it in. So I'm outside here in the garden, and I'm really just going to tackle a few stages of mainly paint preparation, and then we'll go on to applying some primer and talk a little bit about primers. So, nice box of paints here. We won't be needing these straight away. This is all just to show you the different things that I've got and different things that I can use later on, but this is not the sort of thing you want to be rushing into at all. First things first is your body shell. Now the great thing about Helgen's model is the top comes off in one piece, which means that when you're respraying the body shell, and it's not always the case with models, you can just take it off, and there's no masking to do on the underside of it. It makes the whole process a lot easier. So this thing was in load haul livery, so orange and black to start with, and before respraying any model I like to take off the old paint, and there's a good reason for that. It's mainly because all of your detail will be lost if you go and apply another load of paint on top of the paint that's already there. So I prefer to use a solvent paint stripper, and paint strippers are very harsh on plastic. Now it's okay on this sort of plastic, but you don't want to leave it on too long, but especially where there's glazing and things like that, you want to remove all of those parts beforehand, and on Helgen's model they were glued into place. So there was a bit of force to get them out. Luckily they all came out in one piece. Just push them in through with my fingers, and then of course there's all of the cleaning up to do, but you tend to find that paint stripper can never get rid of all of the paint in just one hit, and you need to work it in quite well with one of these stipple brushes, and that gets into all of the little parts where you can't ordinarily access with just one hit of the paint stripper. And you might find that it will take 2 or 3 goes with the paint stripper to completely take off everything from the model. Sometimes there is some stubborn areas which you just won't get to with paint stripper alone, and that's where you need to go in with something a little bit coarser. I've got a selection here of sanding sticks. Don't go for your sort of coarse one. This is a 60-100 grit. Whatever you do, don't use one of those. This here is a 600 and 1000 grit, and you can start to sort of flatten out your surfaces. You tend to find that these are a good indicator if the sides of your model are flat or not, because you'll end up with a smooth surface or areas of discoloration. So work that across the entire surface of your model. Round the rivets and areas like that you want to be careful. So on this model I use some wire wool. I just found that works. But be careful with wire wool on areas such as these grills here, which are etched in brass. You might end up with some wire wool just getting caught around the outside of it, and next thing you know you've bent or pulled off the entire etch. So once you're entirely happy with all of that and you've got out as much as possible, you can give it a good rinse off under the tap, and you might find that there are still some stubborn bits of paint that won't come out, such as in these little grab handle areas here and around the door. And for that I tend to use the very sharp point of a needle file, and I usually just go in there and try and work out all of the paint as much as possible, being very careful not to scratch any of the surrounding areas. And if that's not doing the trick and you want to apply a bit more pressure, then do so with one of these. They're these little sanding sticks, very pointy. These I think are from Fine Scale Model Railway. You can just work them into the corners there, applying as much pressure as you want because you won't damage the plastic, but it'll remove all of the paint. So with all of the paint done and removed as much as possible, it's time to start tackling the degreasing of the project. Now that means getting rid of all of the grubby mitts that you've been handling this model with, which will leave traces of oil. Now you might not see them, they're invisible to the eye, but they're a very, very thin film, and it will prevent, to some extent, the primer from working as it should do. So under the tap, I tend to find a sort of automotive cleaner degreaser is quite well, but make sure you use those outside, they can be quite nasty. Give them a good rinse off and let it to dry completely. And if you're not entirely sure that it's dry or you're in a bit of a rush, you can just give it a quick whiz over. I've got my airline and a compressor here. This is probably overkill for the average paint job, but I can just turn it on and then work it over the model, especially in areas where there are vents, and you can just work that into all of the corners. And anything that might be stuck in, such as bits of wire wool, or perhaps you've got some fluff from a paintbrush, you'll have a completely dry model. And then you might be saying, well, okay, I've now got a completely dry model. What do you do next? Well, the first thing you don't do is handle it like I'm doing now. We're just imagining that we've cleaned it off. The next stage is to don the gloves. Now, these are disposable latex gloves, and whenever painting I tend to use these because it prevents you from handling the model with oily fingers and getting some grime on it. Now, with the gloves in place, you can handle it to your heart's content really, and also you don't have to worry about paint getting everywhere on your fingers, but that shouldn't be a problem anyway because you'll be painting this perfectly, won't you? I know you will. But what happens if you've accidentally put a scratch or a gouge in the side of your model? It can happen, especially when you're using needle files like that. Well, I tend to go in with a sanding stick if it's very, very thin and it doesn't really go that far into the surface of the model. You could alternatively apply a filler primer, which will be a little bit thicker, and then you can sand that back, and hopefully there won't be too much of a difference in height. If not, you can sand it again and reapply your primer. And if it's really deep, you'll need one of these. It's a model filler. This one's from Humbrol. It's one part, which means that you just take the top off, squeeze a bit out, give it a bit of a stir, apply to your model, let it dry, and then hey presto, you can sand it smooth. There are some other fillers which are two parts where you need to mix an activator with it, a little bit faster drying, but I tend to find the results between the two are very comparable. With that in mind, you can then start to proceed to your primers. Now, I've got a selection of primers here I'd just like to talk you through. We've got one here which is from Railmatch, so this is just its universal primer. The main thing with primers is you're applying it to your model so that the top coat gets a good key. This here, for example, is a black plastic injection moulded model, and that means that painting it with especially with a light yellow colour, which we'll be applying to the front, can be a bit tricky. So if we can use a primer which isn't dark in colour, it's either a grey or a white, that's ideal because it'll help sort of mask some of that black plastic. So there's the universal primer from Railmatch. We've got one here which is from Phoenix Precision. This is a 2-pack primer, which means that you've got to mix these in equal quantities. You've got an activated thinners here, which activates the grey etch primer, and this is mildly acidic, hence the name grey etch primer. So this could be used on models which tend to be in brass, just so that it eats its way very slowly into the surface and gets a good key. If not, then you can just go ahead with a normal primer. For example, this plastic model will be fine. And then we've got a selection here. This is in can format, so this is a metal primer from Mr. Hobby. So this is a Japanese company. I haven't used this yet, but I will be on this project. Specifically this one, it's Mr. Surfacer. Now, Mr. Surfacer is just a name that they've given to their range. They've got, it's Mr. Everything with this range, really. Everybody's a Mr. This is its 500. Now, these work in different numbers. So you've got 500 here. You've got 1500 here. These are in the sort of jar format. So this is designed to be sprayed through an airbrush and thinned, whereas this is in can format. Now, it works much like sandpaper. So 500 is quite a thick primer. 1500 is the thinner primer. But all said and done, because it's in this format, you could spray this and thin it down to any particular sort of thickness you want, but you can see there it's quite fluid, it's quite liquid in the jar, and that's at sort of 1500 consistency. So you could use that straight from the jar as you want, if you wanted to. Now, with all of these primers, the key thing to bear in mind is that you want to give it a universal coat all over your model, but you don't want to hide the detail, such as your rivets and your little grooves and mould lines in the plastic. So apply the minimum required just to make sure that you can double check that you've got no imperfections in the surface of your model, there's no gouges or any scratches or things like that. And once you're done, let it dry. And you want to let it dry for at least 24, 48 hours, possibly more. The longer the better, because if you need to start sanding away at these primers, you need to make sure that the primer's fully hardened. You can't do it in about 2-3 hours later. Hence why painting takes time. Now it is difficult for this project because I will be doing it in the magazine at the same time. So I'll be doing a quick skit through all of this on camera. The video guys are going to shoot in a bit, and then we'll catch up, and don't miss how I weathered the model in the magazine. Right, so getting rid of all the moisture on the model there from the airline, just drying it off completely before we actually start to spray. But before I start spraying, I'm just inspecting everything up close to make sure there are no defects at all. Time to start hitting this thing with some primer. So I'm working in large sweeping motions here, just starting off at the sides and working around the ends. Really good primer this actually for getting a good key on the model. Just shake the can from time to time to make sure there's no sediment in the bottom there. So out comes the sanding stick. Now there's a good reason I'm using one of these, and that's to make sure that I get rid of that very slight orange peel effect you might get when you're applying a primer. Primers are great for providing a good key to the top coat, but I just like to make sure that the surface is nice and smooth. This is 1000 grit. You can just see I'm generating a bit of dust at the same time, so once I've done with this, I'm going to take out the airline and just give things a little bit of a nice clean over. I want to make sure that this is completely dust free, there's no residue left of the primer whatsoever. Check it with your finger, but you'll know that there's no dust coming off it when you don't see any dust coming away. Just make sure you get into all those little vents and screw hole areas, things like that, which are prone to accumulate some of the dust there. Let's talk about masking tape a bit. This is the sort of common traditional modeller's masking tape. You'll note there that it's got a nice fine straight edge on it, which is one of the key properties, and it's low tack. However, you might want to look at using one of these. This is just a sort of upgraded, above standard decorators masking tape, also low tack, and you'll note it's got a nice sharp edge on it as well, so don't neglect to use those. Of course, I'm cutting all of these with a just standard pair of scissors really, but for the trickier areas which are harder to reach with masking tape, you might want to consider using one of these. It's a bottled masking fluid. This is Mr. Masking Sol by Mr. Hobby, and you just apply this with a brush, let it harden, and you can spray away and then peel it all away when you're done. Now on the model you'll note that the front area is going to be sprayed in a yellow colour if we refer back to the photograph. So I've just masked this off with some finer masking tape around the edges, just using the larger tape at the front. Just makes it more cost effective really when you're using masking, because it does actually all add up, these different products. Again, just check that all of your angles are square. So one last go over with the airline, just making sure I don't remove the masking tape before we start hitting this thing with some paint. Now just before I start with the airbrush, I want to make sure that it's not just the model that's completely clean, but also the work surface. It is prone to accumulate quite a bit of dust when you're blowing all of this dust off the model, so we don't want any of that coming away on the model. Okay, time to start talking about paint. Now, this is going to be a faded livery, so before we actually get started mixing some paint, this is a Rail Match Mainline Blue. I'm going to tone it down a little bit using some grey. Normally I tend to use cream colour, there we are, Regional Dark Blue, that's number 209. It's the same colour for Regional Railways, and I'm also going to mix it with some 313 Coach Light Roof Grey, just to tone it down a bit and fade it, but again you could use cream for this sort of job. But before mixing the two together, stir thoroughly to make sure that you've got the right consistency and that all of the little sediment from the bottom's mixed up, and I'm just using the back end of a paintbrush, again thinning about 50-50 with some thinners. Okay, let's start shooting some paint at this. So we've got everything masked off, we're quite happy with the colour we've chosen. The settings on the airbrush here, I've just taken off the little fine nozzle at the end, which is mainly used for preventing some overspray when you're doing finer details. So we're using it on a wide spray pattern here, but this is quite still a narrow spray pattern on the airbrush itself. So we're just gradually building up colour. You can see we're a long way off the final colour, just gradually building up the colour there from side to side in a spraying pattern. Being careful not to flood the side of the model. So we'll just get cracking with this, and then we'll come back later on in the article and you'll see the finished product. Meanwhile, let's start looking at the chassis of the model. Now, this is something that's going to need to be masked off. The last thing I want to do is end up with a load of spray paint over the electronics. So the decoder, we've got light functions in there as well, and I don't want any of these LEDs to have overspray on them. So just using some of the blue masking tape, getting a nice neat edge along the bottom there. And this is something that you should really apply to all areas where you don't want any overspray. I'd rather have too much masking tape than not enough, and actually when you're respraying a model, most of the work done is in the masking of all of your parts and various components. So we're doing both sides, and then we'll go along and start masking the interior of the cabs and also the corridor walkways between the two doors. Now this is Rail Match underframe dirt colour, which I'm just mixing with a little bit of thinners before we get this in the airbrush. About 50-50 ratio there, you can see, of thinners to paint. Give it a good stir with the back of the paintbrush again, just to a sort of a milk-like consistency, if you like. And then once that's done, we can start attaching the airline to the airbrush and start filling this thing with some paint. Okay, so just testing the spray pattern here, just to make sure that you're happy with it before we actually start hitting some paint on the model. You can see I've got the fine nozzle attached on the airbrush again, and before we hit it with some paint, just give it a once over with the airline to remove any of the potential debris that might have happened. I mean, it's a nice day for working outside in my garden, but it is prone to get the odd insect that lands on your model. So, just a quick reference, this is my phone. It's very handy to refer to the image when you're actually weathering a project, just to make sure that you've got the right colour in the right areas. So let's start hitting this thing with some weathered underframe colour. So just a light brush over at the start to tone down that satin black. This is going to take more than one pass, by the way, because the underframe of this livery is actually very, very dirty, as are most locomotives when they've been in action for a little bit of time. Just be careful not to flood the areas of the underframe too much. You can see I've probably applied as much as I can get away with there without it pooling too much, but you can try some effects where you try to make the paint pool. For example, on this fuel tank here, I'll go along later on and just try and make it create a sort of little drip effect down the side. So we'll just leave this to dry, and here we are an hour later, so we're just coming back. You can see the fuel tank sides there, I've let it pool and flood down a little bit to create some effects, and pretty much happy with this. But what I'm going to do now is hit it with some Rail Match brake dust. This is number 416. I've thinned it down again, 50-50. I'm just going to hit these areas here on the underside of the bogies with some of this lighter colour, just to pick out some of the detail there. So it doesn't take much at all just to go over it, just a few sprays, and that's literally all we'll need. Don't want to overdo this effect because you can ruin sometimes the effect of a model when you apply too much paint in one area. So again, on this bogie here we'll do the same thing again, and we might actually just tackle some of the sanding gear on the bogie as well, just to bring that out a little bit as well. Let's have a go with the motor there for the underside, and some areas here as well which might have picked up a little bit of dust, just to vary some of the shades. But we won't overdo this effect because it is quite easy to overdo an effect on a model. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed this DVD and how I achieved the effects on this model, and if you'd like to see the finished model, just check out the issue of BRM that's supplied with it.